It started as a perfect summer day. I'd always loved our family's cabin on Lake Superior, a rustic little retreat surrounded by tall pines and the endless expanse of the lake. That morning, the water was like glass, shimmering under the early sunlight. I decided to take the canoe out for some alone time, something I often did to clear my mind. Paddling out, the world around me grew silent, except for the rhythmic splash of the paddle breaking the water's surface. There was something about being out there, away from everything, that made me feel so small, yet so connected. About half a mile from shore, I stopped paddling and let the canoe drift. The water beneath me was deep and dark, the kind of inky blackness that could make your stomach tighten if you thought about it for too long. That's when I first felt it, a slight vibration under the canoe. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it happened again, stronger this time. It was subtle, like something brushing against the hull. I leaned over, peering into the water, but all I could see was my distorted reflection rippling in the blackness. A few minutes passed, and the lake returned to its stillness. I tried to shake off the unease and paddle on, but something kept pulling my eyes back to the water. Then I heard it, this low, resonating hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard on the lake before, and it set my nerves on edge. I paused, scanning the horizon, but there was nothing unusual. No boats, no planes overhead, no reason for the sound. That's when I noticed the water directly beneath the canoe begin to swirl, slowly at first, like a soft whirlpool. The humming grew louder, and a sudden, irrational panic gripped me. I started paddling back toward the shore, harder and faster than I ever had. But it didn't feel like I was moving. The lake's surface was flat, but it felt as though the canoe was being tugged in the opposite direction. My arms burned as I paddled, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I could swear the water beneath me was glowing faintly, a cold, bluish light pulsing deep below, almost like bioluminescence, but more alive. Suddenly, the canoe jolted, as if something massive had struck it from below. I nearly toppled into the water, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I gripped the edges of the canoe, staring into the water, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, impossibly large, moving beneath me. It wasn't just big. It was wrong. Its outline was blurry, shifting, almost as though it wasn't entirely solid. I couldn't make out any features, but its sheer size was enough to paralyze me. It moved with an eerie grace, circling below the canoe, and for the first time in my life, I felt like prey. I sat frozen, clutching the paddle like it could somehow save me, until the shadow began to ascend. My instincts screamed at me to move, but I was rooted to the spot, watching as it rose closer and closer to the surface. Just before it broke through, the humming stopped. The swirling water went still, and then nothing. The shadow vanished. The glow disappeared. It was as if whatever had been there dissolved into the depths. I stayed there for a moment, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Then I paddled back to shore, not daring to look back. When I reached the cabin, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. I told my family, but they laughed it off. "Just your imagination," they said. "Probably a big fish, or an underwater current." But I know what I saw, or rather, what I felt. It wasn't just something in the water. It was something I wasn't supposed to see. something I wasn't meant to understand. Even now, years later, I can't explain it. Sometimes I think about going back, about venturing out onto the lake again to see if it happens. But every time I consider it, I feel that same primal fear creeping back in, whispering that whatever was out there might still be waiting. I'll never forget the day I visited my friend Darren's lake house. It was my first time on Lake Michigan, and I'd been excited to spend a weekend away from the city, relaxing and exploring the sprawling shoreline. Darren's family had a sleek motorboat, and we planned to take it out that evening to watch the sunset. The idea sounded perfect at the time. We launched from the dock just as the sun began to dip, casting streaks of orange and gold across the water. The lake stretched endlessly in every direction, its vastness almost overwhelming. Darren manned the controls while I sat at the bow, feeling the wind whip through my hair as the boat sped over the waves. For the first hour, it was idyllic. We laughed, drank a couple of beers, and marveled at the endless horizon. But as the sun disappeared below the line where water met sky, the mood shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle change. The air grew colder faster than I expected, and the lake seemed quieter. The kind of quiet that presses in around you, amplifying the smallest sound. The lapping of the waves, the creak of the boat. It all seemed too loud, like the lake had swallowed up every other noise. Even Darren, usually full of jokes, had grown uncharacteristically quiet. We decided to anchor and enjoy the stillness, letting the boat drift slightly. I lay back, staring at the stars as they began to blink into view, but something felt off. The water was perfectly calm, unnaturally so, given how choppy it had been earlier. A thin layer of mist began to form on the surface, swirling around us in tendrils. I sat up, glancing at Darren, who looked as uneasy as I felt. "You hear that?" he asked suddenly. I strained my ears, but there was nothing. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly," he muttered. As if on cue, the boat rocked violently to one side, as if something large had bumped it from below. I grabbed the edge to keep from toppling overboard. Darren scrambled to his feet, shining a flashlight into the water. The beam cut through the mist, revealing nothing. Just dark, empty water. "Probably a log or something," I said, though my voice sounded less certain than I hoped. But then, it happened again. This time, the entire boat lifted slightly, tilting as though something massive had passed directly beneath it. Darren cursed, fumbling with the flashlight, his beam sweeping across the water. I leaned over the side, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was under us, but the lake was too dark. That's when we saw the bubbles. They rose in a perfect line, slow and deliberate, as if marking the path of something deep below. Darren's hand tightened on my arm, his breathing shallow. "We're leaving. Now." But as he reached for the controls, the boat jolted so violently that we both fell. The flashlight tumbled overboard, plunging into the water with a splash. In the brief moment before it sank, I caught a glimpse of something vast and pale moving beneath the surface. It was gone almost instantly, but I swear it was as long as the boat, maybe longer. Darren frantically tried to start the motor, but it sputtered, refusing to turn over. Panic set in as the mist thickened around us, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The water beneath us swirled, and a deep, resonant sound, almost like a groan, vibrated through the air. It was low and guttural, a noise that felt more alive than anything I'd ever heard. I shouted Darren's name, but he was too busy pounding the controls to answer. The groan came again, closer this time, and the boat began to spin slowly in place, as if caught in an invisible current. I clutched the side, scanning the water for any sign of movement, but the mist made it impossible to see. Finally, with a desperate roar, Darren managed to get the motor running. The boat lurched forward, breaking free from whatever had been holding it. He pushed the throttle to full speed, and we raced across the lake, the mist swallowing everything behind us. By the time we reached the dock, neither of us could speak. We sat in the boat, trembling, until Darren finally muttered, "We're not talking about this." And we didn't. Not for years. But even now, every time I see Lake Michigan or hear someone talk about its beauty, I feel a cold knot of dread in my stomach. Something is out there, something too large and too strange to belong in a lake. I don't know what it was, and honestly, I don't think I want to find out. I had no business being out on Lake Huron that late at night, but the silence of the cabin was unbearable. It was my first solo vacation in years, and I'd thought the isolation would be therapeutic. Instead, it was suffocating. The endless stillness gnawed at me, so I grabbed a flashlight, a life vest, and my old kayak, thinking a quick paddle under the stars would help clear my head. The lake was calm as I pushed off from the shore, the ripples of my paddle spreading out like veins across the surface. The moon was almost full, casting an eerie silver glow on the water. It was beautiful, sure, but there was also something unsettling about being out there alone. The shoreline faded behind me, and soon it was just me and the vast, quiet expanse. I drifted for a while, letting the current guide me. The sound of the waves gently lapping against the kayak was soothing at first, but then I noticed how strangely loud they seemed, like everything was amplified. I glanced around, shining the flashlight on the water, but nothing was there. Just the empty surface stretching endlessly into the dark. Then I felt it, a slight bump against the kayak. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The lake was supposed to be calm tonight. There was no reason for anything to disturb the water. I shone the flashlight around again, illuminating nothing but empty blackness. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Another bump, harder this time, made the kayak rock. My heart hammered as I pointed the beam directly below me, but the water was too dark to see anything. I told myself it was probably just a fish or a submerged log, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The water around me began to ripple, though there was no wind. The ripples seemed to come from every direction, converging beneath the kayak. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a deep sigh, resonating through the water. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. I started paddling back toward shore, though I couldn't see it anymore. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of the water, but the kayak felt sluggish, as if something was holding it back. I glanced over the side and saw it, a faint light glowing beneath the surface. It was pale and sickly, like moonlight filtered through murky water. At first, it was distant, but it grew brighter, closer, and then I saw them, shapes, vague and shifting, moving below me. They were massive, but their forms were hard to define through the water. I could make out undulating limbs or fins, but the way they moved was wrong. It was like they were there and not there at the same time, flickering in and out of focus. Panic set in. I paddled harder, the kayak cutting through the water with desperate speed. But the glowing shapes followed, circling beneath me like sharks closing in on prey. The guttural sound came again, louder this time, vibrating through my chest. It wasn't just a noise. It was a feeling, a pressure, as if the lake itself was alive and angry. The kayak suddenly stopped, as if something had grabbed it from below. I screamed, yanking the paddle through the water as hard as I could, but I wasn't moving. The light grew brighter, illuminating the surface in a pale, ghostly glow. I looked down and saw one of the shapes rise just beneath the kayak. It was enormous, easily the size of a whale, but its body was translucent, almost gelatinous, and its movements were hypnotic, like it was swimming through a dream. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I was trapped, staring into something that shouldn't exist, something that felt ancient and impossibly aware of me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light faded. The ripples stopped. The kayak jolted forward, free from whatever had held it. I paddled like a man possessed, not daring to look back. When I finally reached the shore, I collapsed onto the sand, shaking and gasping for air. The lake behind me was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But I know what I saw, what I felt. I packed my things that night and left the cabin without looking back. Even now, the thought of Lake Huron makes my stomach turn. I've searched for answers or similar experiences, but nothing I've found matches. I don't know. Maybe the isolation had gotten to me, or maybe it was something else. Either way, I no longer want to know.